Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, and as always, we begin a game week here on a Monday with our first episode of this week. And Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen set to join me. Unlike usual, we are not going to start off the top by looking back at the most recent matchup, a 24-15 loss to Michigan. Instead, major news dropping here in State College on Sunday. Penn State firing Mike Yurcich, third-year offensive coordinator, 36 games as the Nittany Lions play caller. James Franklin determined that was enough. He had seen enough. He talked about it a bit today at a press conference that we just came from. And so we got a lot to dive into. Let's get to it with Daniel and Mark right here on the Lions 24/7 podcast. And fellas, as I said, we kind of changed up our this shook up a lot for us. And Mark, no time in James Franklin's first 9 seasons did he determine that he wanted to dismiss a coaching staff member before the regular season concluded. And as he told us, his mind was made up. He feels like once he gets there, he's got to act on it, and that's where they are. So with 2 games remaining in the regular season, Mike Yurcich is no longer part of the equation for the 8-2 Penn State Nittany Lions.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would have been shocked had this happened after the season, but the fact that it happened now, I think tells you, I don't want to say the pressure that James Franklin's feeling, but I think he realizes how important it was to win at least one of those 2 games against Ohio State or Michigan. And the fact that the offense was the issue, the primary issue in both of those games. I mean, let's face it, the defense wasn't perfect, but it played more than well enough for Penn State to win both of those games. Same thing goes for the special teams. After struggling early in the year, special teams really turned it around after the bye. And you look at the way that offense kind of regressed and just didn't look good. And then more importantly, I think you look at the struggles of Drew Allar. And, this is your franchise quarterback. This is the guy you're hanging your hat on. And the way that he was struggling in those big games, what message is that sending out to other quarterbacks out there who you're trying to recruit or who have committed or who whatever? So I think it just speaks to how seriously James Franklin took this. He's not been afraid to make changes, obviously. He's done it quite often, but usually right after the regular season. So the fact that he did it now, I think he gets the sense of urgency. And I think we all do, right? I mean, we all have a pretty good feel for, what those 2 losses meant and what the fact that it was one side of the ball that really took them down in both of those games.
I don't think any of our listeners need to be fully reminded, but just kind of to go through the bullet points of what occurred against Ohio State and Michigan. Penn State managed only 5 third down conversions on 30 tries. That's a 17% conversion rate on third downs in Columbus and then in Beaver Stadium this past Saturday. They had 10 second-half possessions that took place where the Penn State was facing an 8-point deficit or less, so 10 possessions in the second half where you can tie it, take the lead. 0 points out of those possessions. Half of them, 5, ended up with 3-and-out punts. And then you had Penn State in single-digit scoring until the final minute of the Ohio State game and the final 2 minutes of the Michigan matchup. They were at 9 points before that late touchdown against the Wolverines, and they had 6 points against Ohio State before Caden Saunders finds the end zone with about 30 seconds remaining. And so, Daniel, look, I think when James Franklin went in the direction of Mike Yurcich when asked about Drew Allar's struggles in their post-game press conference on Saturday, a lot of us saw the flag raised, and a lot of us wondered if he would still be the offensive coordinator for this team after Thanksgiving weekend, much less in a bowl game. And we've got our answer. He did not make it to mid-November, as it turns out. What do you make of the move, the timing of it, and ultimately what James Franklin owns from the situation, an offensive coordinator that he pretty aggressively brought in January of 2021?
I think that there's going to be a lot of attention on who James Franklin brings in next as Penn State's next offensive coordinator. I think that you make this move, and especially to do it in the aftermath of a high-profile game. I don't think the TV ratings have come out yet, but there are a lot of people watching that game. A lot of people saw what Penn State did or didn't do on offense, and then you turn around and you have you let the architect of that offense go. I think that it speaks volumes as to how James Franklin felt about how this offense has gone this year, and everything along those lines. But I think that it just kind of shows that I think it shows too how much stock they had put into these 2 games this year, that they knew that these 2 games against Ohio State and Michigan would define their season, would determine what the postseason would look like, if there would be a postseason, if you're going to make that 14 playoff. So the timing of it definitely surprised me. I think that, Mark kind of laid it out while we were talking, that this is something that we haven't seen before under James Franklin. But at the same time, you look at how he brought in Mike Yurcich pretty quickly after that 2020 season when no one was really expecting it. And so Yurcich's tenure is kind of bookended with a kind of sudden arrival and a sudden departure. And there's a lot to dissect of what happened in between, and there's going to be a lot to dissect of what happens next. But I think that kind of the circumstances of that loss on Saturday, everything that went into it, how it looked, I think that probably gave James Franklin plenty of reason to make that decision right now.
And this isn't a knee-jerk thing. You know that James Franklin was kind of measuring where he was with Mike Yurcich over the course of the season, over the last few seasons. And I think we all acknowledged in 2021, and when we were all covering this team, that it was not a good offense. And Sean Clifford, was not nearly as sharp as he would prove to be in year 2 under Mike Yurcich's offense, of course. And he was banged up for much of that season as they go down that second half spiral. But remember how awful this ground game was and just how perplexing that whole situation was. It was before you get Singleton and Allen on campus last year and doing their thing. But it was like historically bad level for this rushing attack. And I remember Jaywan Sider, it was getting late in the season when we had him on a call, and you could just hear him, you could just sense the frustration and the lack of answers for him in that ground game at that stage. And he talked about working with the new system and new offensive coordinator, and that's all part of it. One thing we talked about, though, Mark, back in that season was you're not going to get rid of Mike Yurcich already because he picked up the commitment of Drew Allar. And when he offered Drew Allar was a 3-star on his way to 4-star. And by the time they signed Drew Allar, he's the Ohio kid with an Ohio State offer and the 5-star player and the number 1 quarterback recruit in the country. And when you bring a guy like that on board in your first year on campus, and all of a sudden he's in your quarterback room in January 2022, it's going to buy you some opportunity, I think, as an offensive coordinator. And then you follow that up with Sean Clifford's finest season as a quarterback at the college level, and there were 5 of those, or 6 of those, I should say. And he finishes on a high note, ends up being an NFL draft pick. You got to give some credit to Yurcich and the work there. And then the ground game, I mean, it takes off in a huge way. It in some ways carries them to the finish line in a 5-game win streak against the Rose Bowl, with Sean Clifford playing clean football and the ground game being explosive. And then a lot of that went away here in year 3. It's tough to make sense of it because if you're looking for continuity in the Mike Yurcich era, there's very little to find. And Drew Allar was kind of pointed to as a life preserver of sorts early on when he was struggling. And now, despite the fact that number 15 is the starting quarterback, they're sharing a room, James Franklin still determines it's not worth it to keep Mike Yurcich on board. And he talked about having to sever that relationship. So this was a very convicted James Franklin, it sounds like, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the post game when he effectively said that they didn't give Allar the chances that he needed to succeed. I'm paraphrasing, but out of his press conference today, when a coach says that they did not run the game plan that he expected, that's kind of serious stuff. And yeah. I think that's why, I mean, to me, I don't think you have to read between the lines there whatsoever. I mean, it's one thing for a lack of development or whatever else. It's another thing if you go into a game expecting one thing, and we're taking Franklin's word for this. I don't know why he would say anything different, because he basically said the same thing after the game, right? That they went in expecting one thing, and that when the game got there, it didn't happen. So, yeah, I mean, we can talk about big picture stuff like where the offense was last year and where it was this year. But to me, I mean, that kind of borders on insubordination in a game, right? I mean, it doesn't border on it. I mean, if that's what happened, if you're expecting one thing to happen and it doesn't, that's pretty big. And I think it may explain why this decision was made now rather than after the season, because you get to that point, again, going back to what I said, I do think it's important they needed to win at least one of these 2 games against the other Big Ten East, powerhouses. But when I heard that today, I was like, okay, now this makes a little bit more sense. And then he also, and again, I'm paraphrasing because it's too hard to quote all this stuff directly. You're better at it than I am, Tyler. But, he basically said that he talked to his staff about this as well. I mean, and I think we know who, some of the people that he leans on. And I don't think this was just Franklin saying, okay, we're doing this. I think ultimately that's what it was. I think it's his decision. but we know that he has sounding boards within that program, and I'm sure he used those sounding boards, and I'm sure he talked to Allar, about this. Again, maybe not before he made the decision, but he must have had a comfort level that Allar would be kind of okay with it. I guess we'll see. I wish they would have made Drew Allar available this week. I think they're not doing themselves any favor by not making himself available, because the kid carries himself extremely, extremely well, as we've learned, even in the most difficult situations. But I guess we'll have an opportunity to talk to him after the Rutgers game. We'll see how that goes.
The final question of the press conference, or one of the final questions of this press conference, was regarding the implementation and the execution of an offensive game plan, both of those things. And James Franklin says he feels like they need to change how they approach each of those methods in terms of the Sunday through Friday aspect of setting the game plan together, and then actually executing it during those 60 minutes of football, which is where we saw some of those frustrations bubble up to the surface, I thought, for James Franklin. And kind of, he's never going to pull that curtain far wide for us and explain how it goes down when he gets rid of a member of his coaching staff. But clearly there was a frustration with that. And something else that stood out to me, Daniel, I know you caught this, and it was in the article that you posted, and James Franklin breaking down his perspective here. He said, quote, "I think we're a little bit more collaborative right now than what we've been here recently, and I think it's been good." What do you make of that?
I think it goes to what Mark had just touched on a little bit in terms of what you're seeing, what you're expecting from what happens during the week into what you get on Saturday. And I think that what we kind of learned about Mike Yurcich in the 2+ years covering him is that he's not exactly the most cuddly person. I don't think. He's someone who definitely has his own edge. I don't know him well enough to say that he's stubborn, but you could definitely see where he's the type of guy that maybe behind closed doors, he might want to do things his own way sometimes. So I thought that was really interesting, especially when you talk about James Franklin discussing being more collaborative and that process, and then you look at the names that are getting elevated with things. Jaywan Sider has been on staff for 6 years, has that assistant head coach title. Ty Howell has been here since 2020 in his 3rd year as a position coach, but he's someone who's a letterman and someone that James Franklin has really, really spoken effusively about in terms of how he is progressing through the coaching profession. And then you have Danny O'Brien with the quarterbacks, who is someone that James Franklin has known for probably like 15 years at this point, going back to his recruitment before coaching him at Maryland. So I think that you look at those names and James Franklin talking about being more collaborative, and I guess you can say communication is probably better in there. You look at who those guys are, how long they've been around. I think that you can kind of read between the lines there that the working relationship with those guys right now is probably a little bit better than it might have been these past couple weeks or however long with Mike Yurcich. So I think that in terms of reading between the lines a little bit right there, I think that James Franklin has a lot of trust and respect in Jaywan Sider and Ty Howell. It's going to be interesting to see what this operation actually looks like. But from what James Franklin was saying about what's been happening behind the scenes, I thought that was really interesting. And it's one of those things that your ears kind of perk up when you hear it. And it's another piece of the puzzle, I think, in terms of why this decision was made and why now.
It's interesting because the last time we spoke with Mike Yurcich and the last time we will speak with him as Penn State's offensive coordinator was during the bye week. We got all 3 coordinators, and I remember him actually talking about how he felt it was a collaborative effort in that offensive room coming up with the game plan. And kind of it ran a little counter to what we just discussed. And of course, you're hearing 2 different perspectives, and after a firing or after a breakup or what have you, there's going to be 2 very different perspectives. But we were just front and center with James Franklin, and we're on this campus. We're not sure where Mike Yurcich moves on to, but when it comes to it, it's going to be Jaywan Sider and Ty Howell being co-offensive coordinators. Those are actually titles they officially held with this roster or with this staff. I don't know if a lot of people noticed that, but now they're the interim co-offensive coordinators in more of an official capacity when you look at those titles, it more has to do with, I think, salary and kind of where you are in terms of your coaching career. And now these guys are going to be much more involved in play calling. We didn't get a clear answer from James Franklin on if there's a solo guy who's going to be individually dialing up those plays and handling that on Saturday against Rutgers. It's something they're working through right now. But Ja'Juan Seider, year 6 here, and then Ty Howell, year 3 as the position coach, year 4 on the staff, a former Penn State team captain. And as you mentioned, Danny O'Brien, graduate assistant, stepping up to the plate in the quarterback room. James Franklin says he's not going to miss a single quarterback meeting moving forward now. So, Mark, what do you make of the plan moving forward here from the offense with Rutgers, Michigan State, and a yet-to-be-determined bowl game? You'd imagine it's probably going to be a ranked opponent based on Penn State projecting as a 10-2 finish, so that could be a significant test. We'll talk about if they add an offensive coordinator between now and then and what that might mean for December's outlook. But what do you make of the opportunity in front of Howell, Seider, and O'Brien?
Yeah, I think just going back to what you said, I think the bowl game could be a completely different thing if they actually have an OC, even if he isn't the officially in that capacity. We've seen before that where they've been able to bring guys in. But, one thing I would point out is that you still have a lot of guys who are familiar with the quarterback position on that staff. I mean, Seider, Higgins, Franklin, O'Brien, all those guys played quarterback, and 3 of them played quarterback at a very high level. I mean, Seider was good. I mean, people forget that he was drafted, 6 picks after Tom Brady, way back when.
Was he picked ahead of Tom Brady, or was he after him?
No, I think he was shortly after. I think that legend may have grown into being picked ahead of him. But in all seriousness, these guys are familiar with quarterback play. I mean, even Terry Smith was a quarterback back in high school. Not that he's going to be helping out on the offensive side, but they have enough people on that offensive staff who understand that position. And I think having Danny O'Brien, if people didn't read Daniel's story on Danny O'Brien, just a terrific piece, wasn't sure it was going to come into play the way it kind of has, because it looked like Danny may be kind of their, temporary QB coach. That wasn't made official yet, but it seems like it could be trending in that direction. But I think they have enough people to handle that quarterback position. And Franklin said that he'll pitch in there. We'll see, what exactly that means. But I've been nothing but impressed by Ja'Juan Seider every single time I've dealt with him. Whether it's professionally, whether it's personally, whether it's BSing at a camp, whatever, the guy carries himself extremely well. He's extremely intelligent. I have no doubt that he completely knows, what he's up against here, or what he's in for. And the same thing with Ty Howell. I mean, the saying, centers are the smartest guys on a football team. And this guy was a center who, for Penn State, who, if you go back and look, he's the first one to say, he would never recruit himself because he was so small, but he ended up being a pretty good player on some really good teams because he was so smart, the son of a coach. So, these guys have been around, and I think they're going to be fine for these last 2 games, especially considering the caliber of opponent that they're playing. With all due respect to Rutgers, they're coming off a really tough loss, obviously at Iowa, and you wonder how much starch that's going to take out of them. And then Michigan State, we've seen what's kind of gone on there. So maybe that plays into it as well with Franklin, not suggesting that he's not taking them one game at a time, but maybe he's not taking them one game at a time. But I think between those 2 guys, I think they'll be fine. And again, I think it's important that you have enough guys on that staff who have been around quarterbacks, who have played quarterback, who know what it's all about, that it's not going to be like Allar and Pribula and Smolik are going to be kind of, floating in the wind out there, without any guidance. These people know how to help them out.
Daniel, the head coach, is going to make the final decision. He made the decision here. He owned the decision in firing Mike Yurcich. And we talked about a few years ago what required to get Mike Yurcich in firing Kirk Ciarrocca after 9 games during the COVID season and kind of pulling the plug on that plan very quickly. And he had wanted Yurcich before that. He had an opportunity. He brought him to campus. And now here we are. Another coaching search is underway. But before we find out the identity of who that's going to be, what do you make of James Franklin's approach here? Now, this is go round number 6. He obviously brought someone familiar with him when he came here to campus, but it's going to be the 6th different offensive coordinator. 2 of them have left to become head coaches. This is the 3rd one who's been dismissed by Franklin. And what do you think in terms of what he needs to find for himself? And he says his role, at least this season, is going to be similar to what it's been as a head coach in the offensive room for the last 13 years as a head coach. He says he's going to be, kind of the same presence and do that thing. I know there's some kind of wondering out there among the fan base is what does his presence look like on Saturdays during the game? What do you make of how he needs to move forward with this move? Because it's not his first rodeo.
Definitely. I mean, I think that he's going to have the front row seat to see what Danny O'Brien does with these quarterbacks, what Jalen Sider and Ty Howell do with this offense. And he said that he's going to be more involved in the quarterback room. I think he said he's going to be in every meeting in there with Danny O'Brien and Allar and that group. And then I think that he said that he's going to be involved in the offense. And I think that to a certain extent, he always has been. So he's going to get to see what Jalen Sider and Ty Howell, how they're handling it, what they're doing. He's going to get a really, really close look at them in this room. But I think that with James Franklin, I think the one thing that we've learned about him is that when he makes a decision like this or makes a move like this, that there's some sort of plan in place. Something, he's thought about it and he kind of knows a direction that he wants to go in. So I'm curious to see what that looks like. I do think the timing is interesting just from the carousel perspective. It seemed like this year, this carousel really started spinning yesterday with some of the moves that were made in terms of head coaches, and into today actually with some more. And James Franklin said that he wants this hire to be made sooner rather than later. He made the comparison to hiring Manny Diaz in 2021, where they were able to get Diaz in the building in, I think, like early mid-December, like less than a week after Manny Diaz got fired at Miami. But they were able to have him there for bowl prep. So he was able to be in the building, see how things go, kind of learn the personnel, learn a game plan, see how things work so that when you get to spring, there's already kind of a framework there for him to work within. And Franklin acknowledged that, depending on where they're getting someone from, that might not be applicable for this offensive coordinator spot. But, I think you give yourself, if that's what you want, if you want to have that kind of turnaround, giving yourself an extra 2 weeks to do that. I don't think that hurts. So I'm curious to see how this sort of shakes out in these next couple of weeks. One thing too with Franklin is that it seems like when he makes these coaching changes, the names that kind of pop up first or that seem the most logical, by the time you get from point A to point Z, you're kind of like, wait, we started here and now we're here.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, Manny Diaz, I don't think was on people's radar that much. I mean, Marcus Hagans felt like one that didn't really get going until the very, very end. So it's going to be a fun ride, I think. But Franklin's given himself some good runway, to figure this out, I think the one question that is probably worth a follow-up at some point before the end of the season is if Jalen Sider and Ty Howell are, legitimate, if he views them as legitimate candidates. Because I think also if he views them that way, these 2 weeks are, pretty crucial for them and for him from the evaluation standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I think that, it is kind of weird for an 8-2 team to fire their, very prominent offensive coordinator who got them their 5-star starting quarterback. But I think that James Franklin wants to make a change and he wants to give himself the opportunity to have all of the information before he makes his next decision.
Yeah, James Franklin didn't go out and say that Jalen Sider and Ty Howell are effectively auditioning for the job or anything like that. They're interim title right now. But let's face it, I mean, both of these guys may want to. I mean, it may be at the top of their list right now and say, I want this job. You just don't know. And then you look at Sider's track record. He has not been an offensive coordinator at the solo level, but he's been a running backs coach at this level, a Power 5 since 2010. He's been the assistant head coach here, a title that he earned a couple years ago. And we know that as a quarterback who's done it at a high level and in college and NFL, gotten to do it there, he brings a lot more knowledge. If you talk to Jalen Sider, I always enjoy the full scope of offensive perspective he provides you beyond just his running back room, and he does that in a very nuanced way. And then Ty Howell, a guy who got an opportunity early in his career in his 20s to be, carry an offensive coordinator title at a lower level of football. He's come here, spent 4 years on campus, and former team captain. There's a lot that you like, but let's be honest. I think if you're looking at a lean in-house between either of these guys, you would think you'd gravitate toward Jalen Sider here in this situation. But my question is, if you were to come out and say, yeah, these guys are candidates, I mean, either way, if they feel like they're candidates, now all of a sudden you're at a risk of alienating two guys that you really like. I'm not going to say they will, but this throws a whole nother dynamic into play, fellas, because with Mike Yurcich gone, neither of these guys are quarterback coaches. Jaywan Sider has played the position. I guess you could shift him over there, but he's got a damn good track record as a running back coach for about 14 years now at the Power 5 level. Ty Howell's a former offensive lineman who has coached tight ends here at Penn State. So the question becomes, if you get in a situation where one of these guys feels like they put it together these final few weeks and they are a worthy candidate and they don't get the job, is there a situation that you got to work your way back from? You'd imagine the relationships are very strong, deep-rooted between James Franklin and Jaywan Sider, James Franklin and Ty Howell. So maybe that's not something that isn't even a worry for anyone involved. But, Mark, I just think that's human nature, and especially in this industry where egos tend to surface in times like these, it's just, just like Deion Barnes. He wouldn't have been thrilled if they brought in an outside guy and said, hey, can you assist this? He to his credit, he got the job, but we don't know that will happen in this case. And I think you'd probably say the odds are more in favor of an external hire at this stage of the search. So, Mark, what do you think about the dynamics of the in-house situation and then balancing that?
Well, I guess the question is there some law that says your offensive coordinator has to be your quarterback's coach? And I don't know. Right. I mean, I think that's a question for Franklin, right? I don't know that he would answer that now, though, and understandably, because you might be tipping your hand. But could you make Jaywan Sider your offensive coordinator and then hire a quarterback's coach? Because I don't think you want to not have what he does for the running backs. And I think if you look at his body of work, this season has been an outlier. And I think if you're looking at a situation where the offensive coordinator was fired before the season's over, I think you're probably looking at Franklin's not considering him part of the issue. So again, I think extremely, extremely highly of Jaywan Sider, but I wonder, at some point, do you kind of adjust a little bit and decide, okay, let's try a running backs coach as an offensive coordinator and go bring in somebody who's going to coach quarterbacks. I don't know that that's going to do that's what they're going to do. I don't think that's what they're going to do, but I think it's something that would have to be on the table if you're seriously considering Jaywan Sider, and I think they should seriously consider him. I can't get across, and I think we all kind of feel the same way, how football smart that guy is, and not just football. I mean, recruiting, everything. You see what he's done. He's I don't know where he's going to eventually end up, but he has said himself that, his career, he could spend his entire career here, but he wouldn't mind being a head coach someday. And I could see him being that. I think he has that sort of personality. So I think that's what they have to get across first. I think, unfortunately for these two guys, what are you going to prove in these last 2 weeks that wouldn't have also been proved with Mike Yurcich? You know what I'm saying? I mean, they went down and played Maryland, and Allar looked like, the second coming of Johnny Unitas. And, then he gets in against Michigan, and the kid looks lost again. So I just don't know how much they will be able to hang their hats on these results. Now, what is Franklin going to see in Lash Building? What is he going to see in the meeting rooms? What is he going to hear with the communication during the games? I think those things are bigger things that we're not going to have a great feel for. But when this is all said and done, I think those are some of the questions that will have to be asked.
Yeah, this coordinator search is underway. James Franklin says it's a full-time job. He says right now he doesn't really have time for 2 full-time jobs, but he brought it upon himself. He fired Mike Yurcich. So he was pretty realistic, as you said, Daniel, that while you'd love for a Manny Diaz situation to surface, Manny Diaz was fired and he wasn't contractually tied anywhere. And so that set up things pretty nicely for you in early December. Will that come to the forefront here, or do we wait a little bit longer? Some things to figure out, but they were able to bring Kirk Shiraka, if I recall correctly, down to Dallas for the Outback Bowl. Tyler Bowen, the tight ends coach, was the play caller that day when they set a postseason record for Penn State for points in a bowl game and rushing yards in a bowl game. But Kirk Shiraka was the OC in waiting. He was just kind of down there, flew in. Instead of coaching Minnesota in a bowl, he was watching Penn State in a bowl. And if you could even have a coordinator, your future coordinator, on the sideline at a bowl game like you had Manny Diaz down at the Outback Bowl, that could really set the stage for you come January when everybody reconvenes. You're starting from a little bit more of a you're starting on second base, let's put it that way. When that semester opens, you've got a better feel for what's working, what's not, what personalities are like on that roster, and you've probably already broken some ice on campus with your staff members and with the players that you're going to be demanding a lot from right off the jump. let's get into Drew Allar, because this is a really, as referenced earlier, a really unique situation when you've got not only the quarterback's coach and the coordinator who he's working with on a daily basis, but when you talk about that ascension of Drew Allar, Mike Yurcich is very much joined in at the hip for part of that journey. He's the coordinator, and there were a few of them at the Power 5 level who identified Drew Allar as a target earlier than most, but Mike Yurcich was the one who put the offer out there. And during COVID, Drew Allar takes during the COVID sanctions, he comes and takes the unguided tour of campus, and pretty quickly he ends up committing to the Nittany Lions. And very quickly after that, he is the talk of the college football world as this rising figure. And now Daniel, here he is, the guy that brought him here and believed in him, and has been telling him that he's going to be the best and he's going to help him get there, is no longer welcome in that quarterback room. He's no longer welcome at the Lash building. Danny O'Brien's still there. You look around, James Franklin's still there. I'm wondering, though, we're not going to get to ask him this week, which is unfortunate, but Drew Allar here, 2-game stretch. I talked about it in the post-game podcast. You want to make him believe that you have an answer, and more than an answer, a star at quarterback going into 2024 when he's going to be a junior, because if we have the question of is quarterback figured out going into 2024, that's a whole different conversation that we did not anticipate.
Definitely. Just to go back to two things that Mark was talking about, in terms of the quarterbacks and having your offensive coordinator be a quarterbacks coach and whatnot. I mean, if you decide to go elsewhere with the offensive coordinator being a different position coach, you might already have your quarterbacks coach in the building. Danny O'Brien might be auditioning for that down the stretch. And then the second point with what you're going to be able to prove against Rutgers and Michigan State these next 2 weeks. I think that this is probably one of those situations that's a little bit cliche, but this might be a lot more about the process over the results. I think that that's something else you can glean from reading between the lines of what James Franklin said in terms of the collaboration, things not necessarily looking how they expected to on Saturdays, that sort of communication. I think that the process these next couple of weeks is going to be very, very important in terms of putting that product together on the field on Saturdays. But in terms of Drew Allar, James Franklin I don't think we got any insight really into what this decision affected Allar, maybe emotionally or personally. But James Franklin said that he talked to the quarterbacks before the team meeting on Sunday, and then before the rest of the team found out about, and told them before the rest of the team. And he said that they understood the decision. And I think that the impression that I've gotten from being around Drew Allar and Bo Pribula and talking to them, and I think part of it is due to their situation in terms of coming in together. I think they understand how this works at a certain extent. I think that with Allar, I've never gotten there's never been kind of that entitlement or something along those lines that maybe other players might have. I think that he understands how this works. I think that Bo Pribula does too. Both of them have watched a lot of football. I mean, Drew Aller's a Cleveland Browns fan. He grew up one of those. I mean, he's seen a lot of things when it comes to football and these sorts of transactions. But it is going to be, it is interesting from the personal perspective. I mean, you really laid it out. And I think it was laid out to James Franklin explicitly a couple times where it was, Mike Yurcich is the guy that identified him, offered him early, stayed on him, and got him to State College. And that was before Mike Yurcich had even ever coached a game for Penn State. I mean, I think he'd barely been on the job for 2 months in March 2021 when Drew Allar committed. So I think that there is really something meaningful there. At the same time, though, if Drew Allar and James Franklin are also aligned and he's seeing what James Franklin is seeing, and also Drew Allar is seeing what's happening on Saturdays, he's experiencing what's happening on Saturdays. Yeah. He is what's happening on Saturdays. I think that this is something that he can probably understand a little bit. I think that a lot of these kids come in, and I think that maybe they don't get enough credit sometimes for understanding kind of the realities of the world. I know that some don't, but I think that the impression I've gotten from Allar and Pribula is that they know how this works. They know that they knew they came in from a 2 quarterback class. I mean, Bo Prabula committed to Kirk Shiraka. So, I mean, he's already been through this to a certain extent. So I think that those guys are pros and they sort of know this reasoning, and we'll see what it does for them.
23 days ago, Drew Allar woke up in Columbus without a loss against him in his college career, without a turnover against him in his college career. Here we are 23 days later. He's got a big loss against Michigan, a big loss against Ohio State. He just saw his offensive coordinator just get fired. 3-week span here. You want to talk about grow up, young man? This is going to really thrust him into a kind of a moment that he probably never imagined he would have to encounter here in year one as a starter. But it's here in front of him. We're going to start to learn more about Drew Allar. As you mentioned, Bo Prabula committed to Kirk Shiraka. He stuck around and came in as that second quarterback with Drew Allar in Mike Yurcich's debut class. And then you've had Jackson Smolik, who was another one of those ascending figures late in the cycle. Mike Yurcich makes the move there. They get him on board. So that's a bit of a Mike Yurcich specialty as well. And then Ethan Grunkemeyer from the same quarterback trainer, Brad Mendler out in Ohio, as Drew Allar. This is a guy that Mike Yurcich was far earlier on a lot of people in offering. And obviously James Franklin is involved in that decision as well. But we're talking about your quarterback room here moving forward, whoever's going to be overseeing it being configured by the man who was just shown the door by James Franklin. It's a two-part job. You got to recruit, you got to coach, and obviously not up to the task here at Penn State, determined by James Franklin. In terms of potential candidates, aside from the ones who are here on campus already, we've got a hot board up at lions247.com. It will be evolving. We've got plenty of message board conversation for our VIP subscribers at lions247.com as well. Trust me, our subscribers are carrying the conversation there in that updates piece. But we've also got 10 names, a couple that we mentioned here, a couple that you're familiar with, and maybe you're not. Over at lions247.com for our VIP subscribers. 50% off right now gets you in the door at lions247.com for an annual subscription, or $1 for 1 month. Got a lot going on, recruiting coverage coming out of the Michigan matchup, and this coaching search has now started, and obviously the transfer portal that lies ahead and the signing day that lies ahead. VIP scoop, all there for you right now. Moving forward, though, Mark, normally about 35 minutes ago, I would have said, well, Mark, that happened against Michigan. What is your biggest takeaway? What is your overarching concerns? And you probably would have talked a lot about the offense and Mike Yurcich, and we got that out of the way already. And so let's just come up for some air here. James Franklin said today that he understands it's about beating the most important teams on your schedule. I thought he pretty much owned the reaction that a lot of the fans and the frustration that was expressed. I don't think he pushed back against it. I think he kind of showed he gets why that's being expressed. And he's told us before that he wants to coach with a passionate fan base, because when your fan base is not passionate, that's when you're in trouble. But Mark, what do you make of this Nittany Lions team that has gone from fully in college football playoff contention and with everything in front of it to here's Rutgers coming to you, go up to Detroit and play on Black Friday against Michigan State, and then we'll let you know who you're playing next. And by the way, your offensive coordinator has just been fired. I mean, it's an interesting time in this facility right now.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at another 10-2 season, and again, Penn State has kind of set that as something that it's capable of doing, and I think people are just waiting for this team to take that next proverbial step. They've been waiting for it since 2016, and they haven't been able to do it. And that's where we can talk about firing your offensive coordinator or going through however many offensive coordinators. But I mean, the common theme at this point is the head coach. And, are they going to be able to get there? I think that's a fair question at this point. And I wonder, honestly, if Franklin, as he's looking at it, I wonder if he's questioning himself, and I'm saying this nothing but respectfully, because I have a ton of respect for James Franklin. I think he's one of the smartest people you're ever going to meet. But I mean, the proof is kind of in the proverbial pudding. They've not been able to get to that next step. And, unfortunately for them, and we've discussed this as well, this was your last opportunity to do it in this format. So, it's almost as if, you finish number 10 or 11 next year and you make your way into the playoff. It's like, well, okay, great. But you weren't able to do it in the situation that existed before, when you had to climb over Michigan and Ohio State to get there. So where is Penn State at this point? You have Michigan and you have Ohio State that are a different level. You have the rest of the Big Ten that are a lower level. And you have Penn State that's kind of on its own little island there and been unable to escape that area and move up. There's no other way to put it at this point. I mean, you could try to sugarcoat it. You could try to look at it a million different ways. But if you've not been able to beat the man, you can't be the man. And Penn State has not been able to beat Michigan and Ohio State when they're performing at an elite level. Just hasn't been able to do it.
And then rolling the ball forward here a little bit, the concerning part is, Mark, that you mentioned Michigan and Ohio State being in that tier, and they've shown it again this year. And then Penn State, that next space that Penn State's occupying, that's about to get a little bit more crowded.
Right.
Oregon, Washington, USC, maybe UCLA, depending on how that program develops. You've got other teams. Maybe one of these teams currently residing in the Big Ten West finds a real pulse one of these seasons, maybe next year, and emerges as a legitimate threat.
Maybe Rutgers and Maryland. I mean,
I'm going to say maybe Michigan. I mean, Michigan State made a college football playoff. They could be one smart hire away from thrusting themselves back into contention as a Big Ten contender. So that in terms of the tiers, it's not going to be any less crowded for Penn State in terms of having to elbow your way and work those rungs of the ladder. And Daniel, again, human nature here coming into play. You take those prizes off the table, the carrot off the end of the stick in terms of trophies and championships here for the Penn State squad. What are you most eager to learn here, starting with Rutgers game week?
I think that you go back to what Mark was talking about, finishing 10-2. And I mean, all 10-2s are not created equal. I think that a 10-2 like you had last year means something a lot different than a 10-2 this year. We talked about that at the very end of the post-game pod on Saturday night about how I think that this year you were supposed to take the step. Last year, it wasn't necessarily a happy to be here type thing, but it was, we're getting this program to the point where you can make a jump. I think that that's what the finish last year really set Penn State up for this year. And then you don't do that. So I think that, in the interview room after the game, we talked about the emotion that we saw from Theo Johnson and some of the other players. I think about when Penn State lost its second game last year to Ohio State. I think that there was still some emotion. I mean, Sean Clifford obviously was particularly emotional after that game, but it was a little bit different compared to what we saw this past Saturday. I think that there was a really big realization that this team let a very, very prime opportunity to do it with this group, with this defense, with this talent, some of this talent on offense. They really let it slip by. So I think the one thing that you are really going to be focused on is, how do they come out against Rutgers? We talked about letting Ohio State beat you twice. Is Michigan? I know Ohio State almost did that in that Indiana game. So are you going to let Michigan beat you twice in this sort of game? I feel like we're looking at maybe a little bit of a dicey first quarter. I mean, it's a noon game. A bunch of students are already going to be gone for Thanksgiving break. You're coming off a pretty bad loss to Michigan. People know that you're out of the mix for the Big Ten and the college football playoff. There's a possibility that it's a very, very stagnant environment in Beaver Stadium on Saturday. And so I think that this is where we learn a lot about the leaders on this team and as a team as a whole. I think down the stretch last year, we learned a lot about Sean Clifford and Jair Brown. With Clifford, say what you want about his performance on the field, but he's someone that kept that locker room together. And then Jair Brown was someone that was delivering on the field and off the field. And that every time you talked to him, he was on message. He was one of those guys that was able to talk about the big picture a little bit beyond 1-0, and was really able to lay out a very clear explanation of what he wanted to accomplish, how he wanted to leave this. So you look at guys like these team captains, kind of like Theo Johnson is someone that stands out to me. On the defense,
Isaac, to me,
yes.
You were Theo in post game, and I went to Adiza, and there weren't any emotions like you saw from Theo, but there was a steadfastness, and I'm going to hold the rudder steady here for my teammates. Yes.
And we heard so much coming into this year about this leadership is going to be different. It's going to be more decentralized. This is going to be a real test if that's something that moving forward can help this team get to that next level. So this game, I think, is going to be really, really indicative of that. I mean, I think that Michigan State game, I think that it's going to be unique enough that, because it's 7:30, it's a Friday night, it's Black Friday, you're in Detroit, you're in an NFL stadium. I think that there's going to be enough there to that you can feed off of. I think that it'll be unique enough that you can, that there's stuff there to draw on. But I think this game, it's going to be I think for Penn State, it's going to be the epitome of a bring your own juice game. That, yeah, I don't know if is Beaver Stadium going to help you that much in this game. Are they going to show up like they did for Michigan? No, it's Rutgers. And so you're going to have to deliver on this. You're going to have to, go from the locker room and come out and be able to go from the jump there. So I think that's what I'm looking at Saturday.
And while you were talking, I kind of looked back at some of those sleepy starts in Beaver Stadium, because this is a game that's always late in the calendar. It's after Penn State has picked up a couple of those losses, so they're not in the college football playoff conversation. And some of these dynamics in play, some of it has been Thanksgiving weekend on campus. The last few times, 2017, 14-6 Penn State at halftime. That's when they had Saquon Barkley and Trace McSorley still leading the show. 2019, they were up 7-3 at halftime in Beaver Stadium. That was an 11-win team that season. 2021, 7-0 Penn State over Rutgers in Beaver Stadium. The problem for Rutgers is that while Penn State has been sleepy and stumbly and sometimes hasn't gotten to 30 points, Rutgers has shown no offensive pulse. And by the way, they're coming off of a shutout loss against Iowa. Our old friend Kirk Shiraka coming back to town. It didn't work out for him so well in his return to Beaver Stadium last year as Minnesota's play caller in the whiteout game. He will come back here to campus with Rutgers as a foe once more on a really interesting week for Penn State in terms of offensive coordinator dialogue. We'll talk about Rutgers more on our Tuesday episode. We'll also break down a bunch of recruiting news, potential for a quarterback commitment coming on board, as Steve Wiltfong addressed in a story at Lions247.com, some crystal ball movement. We will cover all that on the next episode. But fellas, we'll be on the practice field Wednesday. I know that there's some basketball coverage along the way this week. Is there anything we didn't get to? Because there's been so much to get to that we didn't cover that you want to put out there right now. I think the one thing we didn't get to in terms of the human nature aspect is the draft declarations last year. I mean, even when you heard that a guy was going to the draft, he was saying, but I'm sticking around because this team is special. I want to be a part of it. That's something for me is, do we see something trend closer to 2021 bowl season where a lot of guys hit the door and a lot of guys were involved in the practice and you had guys flying around in planes when this team was playing in the Outback Bowl? Or is it like 2022, which obviously a team that had a lot more success on the field late in the season, where even the guys who are surefire, pretty top-tier NFL draft prospects are saying, I got one more game. I got one more ride with my brothers here. Mark, that's something we got to learn. And then the other part is freshmen. They've been so very little involvement from that class. Now that you pick up your second loss, you're still playing to win games, but do you retrain yourself a little bit in what you're trying to find from a personnel standpoint here in the next couple of weeks, the film that you're trying to accrue, the evaluations that you're trying to do? So to me, it's the guys at the very top of the roster who are potentially on their way out or considering leaving. And then it's the very bottom of the roster where guys are chomping at the bit to get involved. And maybe the Penn State staff decides it's time to get them some extended run.
Yeah, well, going back to what Daniel said, this is where we find out what leadership is about for this team, right? I mean, it's easy to be a leader when you're winning all of the games, but now you're in a situation where, honestly, what is there left to play for other than each other? I mean, if I ever had the opportunity to play and had a chance to go to a New Year's Six bowl and all the perks you get, I think I would definitely do that because it's pretty cool stuff. But to these guys who have been through it, is it going to matter that much to them? So who are we going to see out there on the field on Saturday? You know what I mean? Do we know? I mean, we've seen, and we haven't seen it here, but do our decisions started to be made already as we speak? So I think it's going to be really important to pay attention to what's going on pregame Saturday. Do they start dialing any of these NFL prospects back a little bit the way they did with a Saquon in a bowl game? I just don't know. We're kind of in uncharted territory, but I think it's going to speak to what the leadership of this team is all about. My guess is that these guys who, have represented and I think have shown themselves to be good leaders, I think they will keep it together. That's just my guess, but you don't know. I mean, you're in a situation where a coach was just fired in the middle of a season. We've never seen that before with James Franklin. I mean, I obviously hadn't seen it with Paterno either. I mean, that guy fired one coach in his last 15 years or something. So it's just, we're kind of in a different dynamic. One thing I do think that's working in Penn State's favor is that Saturday will be senior day. So anybody with between 4 and 1 year left or no years left is going to have the ability to walk. It's not what it quite used to be, but there are some guys who are going to make that walk who I think it's going to be, well, it's probably going to be emotional for all of them. But I think there's something to that even coming off of a tough loss, I think these guys know what they invested in the program, and hopefully enough fans show up that it makes it worth that it makes it a special moment for them. Because this hasn't been the season people were hoping for, but I don't think it was due to a lack of effort. I don't think these guys didn't try hard. I think the seniors, people ought to kind of rally behind them. With respect to the freshmen, I mean, sure. I mean, if these guys are ready to go, you might as well start playing them at this point if you're in a position not to burn the red shirt. I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't do that now, especially with those young offensive linemen. I mean, knowing what you're going to have to replace next year, I mean, I just think it makes complete sense to start getting some of these guys who you think may have a big upside. I'm not suggesting you start them, but if you're fortunate enough to be in these games and you are pulling away, definitely get some of these younger players out there. Give them the opportunity.
Daniel, we'll finish. Just want to offer you the mic. Make sure we didn't leave anything out that you thought needed to be involved here.
Here, let me pull up all the 2-point conversion charts about when you're supposed to go and when you're not supposed to go. No. I mean, I think that I think these last 2 games and these last 2 weeks and going through bowl season, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with Penn State, because it's kind of like we talked about in 2022. Like, you were setting up your springboard for 2023. 2019 was supposed to be a springboard for 2020. You throw that out a little bit, but I think the assumption is under normal conditions, you see something different than what you got. And so I think momentum is a concept that sometimes you can believe in it, sometimes it's a little bit more dubious, but I think that there is something to be said for ending this game on a high note, because these freshmen and these sophomores, these younger guys that are prepared to step into larger roles, I mean, they're looking up to these seniors. They're looking up to these 4th and 5th year guys. So, I think how they handle the end of this season, I think, can affect next season. And I think it also offers the opportunity for some leaders to step up. I mean, I think, Tyler, I think you made a really good point on Saturday night that these are big 2 weeks for Drew Allar. I think both to showcase what he can do on the field, but also for him to be in a position to potentially take over this team next year. I think that he is going to be the guy next year. He's going to be a 3rd-year player. By all expectations, if things go as we thought they'd go, it should be his last year. So this is it. Like, you're going to be the guy next year. You're going to be the one that everyone's going to be looking to. You're going to be in command. So how do you set that up as the season ends? Do you show it on the field? Are you showing it in the locker room? Can you help set the tone for this offseason? Because there should be a pretty big exodus of these 4th and 5th year guys who've been around a lot, played a football, meant a lot to this program. And then you're going to need that next group to step up. And Allar is going to be part of that group. I think we saw with Sean Clifford the value of having a quarterback who can be that emotional leader, that spark, or that fiery guy down the stretch last year. We know that Drew Allar has a different kind of personality, but this is his chance to step into that role a little bit. So I think that these next 2 weeks, there's plenty of stuff on the field. They're still playing these games, even though they lost that second game to Michigan. But I think looking at the practice fields, off the field, in the locker room, is going to be something really, really worth paying attention to and worth kind of keeping our ear to the ground as we talk to these players over these next 2 weeks.
Those conversations will begin on Tuesday and carry on through the week. We'll be back on the practice field Wednesday, and just a lot going on at Lions247.com right now. And I'll finish with this, just to put it in perspective on where the expectations are for Penn State right now and where James Franklin has kind of elevated them internally and how they've carried through externally now. And he heard that in Beaver Stadium exiting the tunnel and those boos and some of the words that were thrown at him. They are going, if they can win these 2 games against Rutgers and Michigan State, they're just about a 20-point favorite against Rutgers. They'll be in the same ballpark against Michigan State. So we expect them to be 10-2. It would mark the 3rd time in this program's run since the 1994 unbeaten season that they have stacked together back-to-back double-digit win campaigns. They did it in 2008 and 2009. They did it in 2016 and 2017. Here they are, probably going to do it again, 2022, 2023. And yet the conversation around this team is about James Franklin getting booed and into the tunnel, Mike Yurcich getting fired as the offensive coordinator. Again, expectations are just in a very different place right now for this program. And we'll see what James Franklin and this team have for answers these next few weeks. And then moving forward, for everyone here at Lions 24/7, the podcast and the .com, Daniel Gallen, Mark Brennan, Grace Brennan, Tyler Calvaruso, and our mighty group of recruiting reporters. We're stepping aside for now. We'll be back with you for another episode Tuesday, and then we'll come back Thursday as well with our preview episode for Rutgers versus Penn State. Thanks, everyone, for listening or watching. I'm Tyler Donahue. We'll see you next time on the Lions 24/7 podcast.